December 21st, 1943. Hans Müller crouches behind a shattered wall in what used to be someone's kitchen, his Fallschirmjäger uniform caked with plaster dust and dried blood. Outside, the screams of his comrades echo through smoke-filled streets as Canadian soldiers methodically clear another block of Ortona, this Italian coastal town that was supposed to be just another defensive position. He grips his rifle tighter, hands trembling not from cold but from something else entirely. The realization that his elite paratrooper training, his proud heritage as one of Hitler's best, means nothing in this hellish maze of rubble where walls explode without warning and enemies appear from holes in floors. Across the street, Private Jimmy Morrison of the Loyal Edmonton Regiment waits in similar terror, holding a sticky bomb and remembering his farm in Alberta, wondering how warfare became this intimate dance of death where you kill men whose breath you can smell. This is Ortona, December 1943, where two armies turned a medieval town into what soldiers would call Little Stalingrad, where 8 days of urban combat would rewrite the psychological rulebook of warfare and prove that technological superiority means nothing when battle becomes personal, when every room holds a grave and every staircase a monument to human determination. The German 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, veterans of Crete, hardened paratroopers who jumped into legend, expected quick defensive work along the Moro River before winter halted Allied advances. The Canadians, specifically the 1st Canadian Infantry Division, expected perhaps a day or two of fighting to secure this Adriatic port for winter operations. Neither side knew they were about to participate in one of World War II's most brutal urban battles, a week-long nightmare that would kill over 2,000 men, destroy an entire city, and leave psychological scars that veterans would carry silently for decades. What happens when elite warriors trained for rapid mobile warfare meet determined infantry in confined urban terrain? What happens when military doctrine collides with architectural reality, when parachutists become tunnelers and farm boys become demolition experts? The answer lies in those 8 December days when Ortona became a laboratory for future urban warfare, a place where human psychology trumped military technology, where cultural determination outlasted tactical brilliance, and where both sides learned that in war's most intimate form, victory belongs not to the best equipped, but to those who can endure one more hour in hell. To understand Ortona, we must rewind to 1943, a year when the Allies believed Italy would be the soft underbelly of Hitler's Europe, a swift campaign to knock out Mussolini and threaten Germany from the south. The Italian campaign began September 3rd with landings in Calabria, followed by Salerno's bloody beaches on September 9th. The same day Italy officially surrendered, though German forces had no intention of leaving. By late autumn, Allied forces under General Harold Alexander pushed north up Italy's mountainous spine, facing not the quick collapse they'd envisioned, but determined German resistance under Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who transformed Italy's natural defensive terrain into a series of fortified lines. The Gustav Line, anchored on Monte Cassino, became the main German defensive barrier. But before that stood the Winter Line, and before that, the Bernhard Line along the Sangro River, where Canadian forces would earn their brutal education in Italian warfare. The 1st Canadian Infantry Division, commanded by Major General Chris Vokes, a blunt, aggressive officer who believed in firepower and frontal assault, had already fought through Sicily's hills, earning respect but also casualties. Now in December, as winter rains turned Italian roads to mud and mountain passes to ice, Vokes received orders to break through German positions along the Adriatic coast, capture the port of Ortona to secure winter supply lines, and prepare for spring offensives. The Canadians were confident. They'd beaten Germans in Sicily, they had artillery support, they had tanks, they had air superiority when weather permitted. What they didn't have was experience in sustained urban combat, in house-to-house fighting, where a single machine gun nest could hold up a company for hours, where every window concealed death. Facing them across the Moro River were German paratroopers, the Fallschirmjäger, elite light infantry who'd earned legendary status at Fort Eben Emael in 1940, who'd conquered Crete despite massive casualties in 1941, who considered themselves the finest soldiers in the Wehrmacht. But by late 1943, these paratroopers rarely jumped anymore. Germany had lost air superiority, mass airborne operations were suicide, so Fallschirmjäger units fought as elite ground infantry, holding the hardest positions, counter-attacking the most dangerous breakthroughs. The 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, commanded by General Richard Heydrich, a tough veteran who'd survived the meat grinder of Crete, had been in Italy since autumn, fighting delaying actions, falling back slowly, making the Allies pay for every mile. Their defensive doctrine was simple but effective: hold fortified positions until enemy pressure became unbearable, then withdraw to the next prepared line, inflicting maximum casualties through the transition. Ortona wasn't supposed to be different. It was just another town, ancient and medieval with narrow streets and thick stone buildings, perched on a cliff overlooking the Adriatic. The Germans had orders to delay Canadian advance, bloodying them enough to slow the Allied timetable, then withdraw north before encirclement. Nobody planned for what actually happened. Neither side anticipated the psychological transformation that urban warfare would trigger, how the town's architecture would neutralize German defensive advantages, how Canadian determination would evolve into something primal and unstoppable. The stage was set by geography and culture. Ortona's medieval layout, built for defense against medieval armies, became equally defensive against modern forces. Streets barely wide enough for a jeep, let alone a tank. Stone buildings 3 or 4 stories tall with walls thick enough to stop machine gun fire. A warren of alleys, courtyards, internal passages connecting buildings, a defender's dream, an attacker's nightmare. But there was something else, something intangible that would matter more than tactics or technology. The Canadians, many of them sons of immigrants or farmers from the prairies, carried a chip on their shoulders. They weren't glamorous British commandos or American Marines. They were viewed as colonials, second-rate soldiers, good for garrison duty. Sicily had proven them wrong, but Ortona would cement their reputation, not through official accolades but through the respect of enemies who fought them, and the horror of civilians who witnessed what determination looks like when it wears a maple leaf. The Germans, conversely, faced a psychological crisis by late 1943. The war was clearly turning. Stalingrad had shattered the myth of invincibility, North Africa was lost, and now Italy was collapsing. The Fallschirmjäger fought with the desperation of men who knew their cause was doomed but couldn't conceive of surrender, who channeled fear into aggression, who saw every defensive stand as proof they remained the master race despite mounting evidence to the contrary. These psychological undercurrents, Canadian determination to prove themselves, German desperation to maintain superiority, would collide in Ortona's rubble with volcanic force. The Battle of Ortona didn't begin in Ortona. It began with the Moro River crossing, December 6th through 8th, where Canadian forces broke through the first German defensive line in a series of bloody assaults that cost over 1,000 casualties. Crossing a river under fire is among warfare's most difficult operations. Attackers are exposed, defenders have clear fields of fire, and artillery can devastate troops packed on narrow bridges or fording points. The Canadians used night attacks, smoke screens, sheer courage, but paid heavily, watching friends drown in icy water weighted down by equipment, seeing entire platoons shredded by machine gun fire. But they crossed, they established a bridgehead, they pushed the Germans back. Next came the advance on Ortona itself, fighting through smaller villages and defensive positions, each one contested, each one costing lives. By December 20th, Canadian forces were at Ortona's outskirts, expecting maybe a day of fighting before the Germans withdrew. That was the pattern, the doctrine, the logical move. But General Heydrich made a different calculation, influenced by factors both military and psychological. Militarily, Ortona's position on the coast meant holding it prevented Canadians from using the coastal road, forcing them inland where terrain favored defense. Holding Ortona even a few extra days bought time for German engineers to fortify positions further north, to prepare the next defensive line. But psychologically, Heydrich understood something deeper. His paratroopers needed a victory, needed to prove they could still stop the Allies, needed to restore pride shattered by months of retreat. Ortona would be that stand. Orders came down. Defend the town in depth, make the Canadians pay for every building, inflict casualties that would shock Allied command and slow the entire Italian offensive. So when the loyal Edmonton Regiment and the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada entered Ortona's outskirts December 21st, they walked into a trap more effective than any minefield. They walked into a defended city where every building was a fortress, every intersection a killing ground, where German paratroopers waited in cellars and attics with machine guns, panzerfausts, grenades, and orders to die in place. The technological advantages that had carried Canadians through Sicily, artillery support, tank superiority, air power, suddenly meant little. Artillery couldn't target enemies 50 meters from your own troops without killing friendlies. Tanks couldn't maneuver in streets barely wider than their treads, couldn't elevate guns high enough to hit attic snipers, became steel coffins when panzerfausts struck from basement windows. Air power was grounded by winter weather, and even when pilots flew, they couldn't distinguish friend from enemy in the rubble. The Canadians were forced to fight with technology's oldest tools: grenades, bayonets, explosives, courage, and the human capacity to endure horror. They adapted, they innovated, they suffered. One innovation would define Ortona more than any other: mouse-holing. Some genius, history doesn't record who, realized that instead of fighting through streets where every intersection was covered by German fire, they could go through buildings, using explosives to blow holes in walls connecting structures, moving through Ortona's interior like mice through a house's walls. Sappers would pack explosives against a stone wall, blow a hole big enough for men to rush through, and infantry would storm the next building, while the dust still hung in the air. It was terrifying, deafening, exhausting work. Soldiers caked in plaster dust, ears ringing from constant explosions, lungs burning from stone powder and cordite fumes. But it worked. It turned German defensive positions inside out, let Canadians bypass strongpoints, attack from unexpected angles, seize buildings without exposing themselves to street fire. The Germans adapted too, rigging buildings with booby traps, leaving small rearguards to delay while main forces withdrew to the next block, setting up new defensive positions in buildings the Canadians had just bypassed. What emerged was a new form of warfare: three-dimensional chess played with high explosives and automatic weapons, where the battlefield was vertical as much as horizontal, where combat happened in basements, ground floors, upper stories, and rooftops simultaneously. Private Jimmy Morrison, the Alberta farm boy we met at the beginning, discovered this reality the hard way. His section was clearing a 3-story house, standard procedure: sappers blow the wall, toss grenades through, then infantry rushes in. They'd done it a dozen times by December 23rd, each house similar, each house terrifying. This time, Morrison was third through the hole, rifle ready, expecting the usual: furniture debris, maybe a wounded German, maybe nothing. Instead, the floor collapsed, a booby trap triggered by their weight, and Morrison fell into the basement where 3 German paratroopers waited. What happened next, Morrison never spoke about in detail, not even to his wife decades later, only that he survived. The Germans didn't, and his bayonet had blood on it when he climbed out. That's urban warfare's psychology. Not glorious charges across fields, but intimate violence in the dark, killing at arm's length, seeing your enemy's face, knowing he might be a decent man under other circumstances, but right now he's trying to kill you, so you kill him first and then you live with that memory forever. The Christmas period brought no truce, no humanitarian pause. If anything, fighting intensified as both sides realized Ortona had become a symbolic struggle beyond its strategic value. German propaganda seized on the battle, claiming Fallschirmjäger were holding the line against superior forces, proving German military excellence. Allied command, embarrassed that a single Italian town was taking so long to capture, pressured Canadian commanders for results, leading to increased attacks despite mounting casualties. On the ground, soldiers on both sides experienced something historians would later recognize as a unique psychological state: urban warfare claustrophobia combined with winter isolation, where the world contracted to the next room, the next building, where time became measured in hours survived rather than days, where the future meant nothing beyond the next firefight. Canadian soldiers developed techniques through brutal trial and error. They learned that grenades worked better than rifles in close quarters, that listening was as important as looking, that patience saved lives. Rushing into a room got you killed, but but waiting for that one German who thinks you've moved on gives you the advantage. They learn to recognize booby trap indicators, furniture positioned unnaturally, undisturbed dust patterns, wires barely visible. They learn the psychological value of noise. Sometimes exploding a wall and then not attacking for hours kept Germans on edge, exhausted, more likely to make mistakes. German defenders developed their own innovations. They turned Ortona's ancient architecture into a weapon, using the thick walls and narrow streets to channel Canadian attacks into prepared killing zones. They employed vertical tactics, snipers in church towers who could see entire blocks, machine gunners in attics covering multiple streets, Panzerfaust teams in basements waiting for tanks. They learned that counterattacks, even small ones, disrupted Canadian momentum, bought time, inflicted casualties that accumulated day by day. But more than tactics, the Germans in Ortona fought with a desperate pride that bordered on fanaticism. These were paratroopers, men who'd volunteered for the most dangerous assignments, who'd been told they were the elite, who couldn't accept that farm boys from Canada were beating them. This psychological unwillingness to retreat, this need to prove superiority, cost German forces dearly. Instead of conducting an organized withdrawal, they stayed and died, holding positions past any rational military purpose, losing experienced soldiers who couldn't be replaced. One German paratrooper, Lieutenant Hans Schmidt, wrote in his diary on December 24th, recovered later by Canadian forces, quote, "We have made them pay for every meter, every building is our fortress. But we grow fewer each day while they seem endless. Where do these Canadians find such courage? They fight like men possessed. Perhaps we were wrong about them. Perhaps we were wrong about many things." End quote. That diary entry, written by candlelight in a besieged building while Canadian artillery pounded nearby blocks, captures the psychological shift happening in Ortona. German certainty crumbling, Canadian confidence building, both sides realizing that this battle was testing not just military skill, but fundamental human endurance. The civilians of Ortona, those who hadn't fled, experienced their own nightmare. Trapped between armies, they huddled in cellars and basements, listening to explosions, feeling buildings shake, wondering if the next shell would bury them alive. Some hid German soldiers, some helped Canadians. Most just tried to survive, protecting children, sharing dwindling food, praying for it to end. After the battle, they would emerge to find their town destroyed, centuries-old churches reduced to rubble, homes where families had lived for generations, now just broken walls and memories. The psychological trauma affected Ortona's civilians for decades. Many couldn't bear to rebuild, emigrating to other parts of Italy or abroad, carrying survivors' guilt and loss. Those who stayed built memorials, not just to dead soldiers, but to their lost city, to the innocents destroyed in 8 December days. This civilian dimension adds another layer to Ortona's significance. It wasn't just a military battle, but a human tragedy, a microcosm of how war destroys not just bodies, but communities, cultures, ways of life. Canadian forces documented the battle's intensity in official records that decades later still convey the horror. War diaries describe buildings changing hands multiple times in a single day, of entire platoons becoming casualties, of men too exhausted to move but forced to keep fighting, of Christmas Day attacks because the enemy wouldn't respect a holiday. Medical officers recorded unprecedented rates of battle fatigue, shell shock's new name, soldiers who simply stopped functioning, staring at walls, unable to speak, having reached psychological limits that training couldn't prepare them for. The loyal Edmonton Regiment alone suffered over 200 casualties in 8 days, nearly 30% of their strength, and the Seaforth Highlanders lost similar numbers. These weren't abstractions. They were men like Morrison, farm boys and factory workers and students who'd volunteered or been drafted, who'd trained but couldn't truly prepare for Ortona's intensity, who discovered reserves of courage they didn't know they possessed and limits they wished they'd never reached. By December 27th, Canadian forces controlled most of Ortona, but the fighting continued in isolated pockets, German paratroopers refusing surrender, fighting from upper stories while Canadians held lower floors, sometimes dying when buildings collapsed from accumulated damage. burying both sides in rubble that became their tomb. The final German withdrawal happened December 28th, not a planned tactical movement, but a desperate flight as remaining defenders realized they were surrounded, cut off from supply and reinforcement, facing certain death if they stayed. Some escaped, filtering through Canadian lines at night, using skills learned in paratrooper training to move silently through rubble. Others didn't make it, captured or killed in the final hours, and some, a handful, simply surrendered, too exhausted to care anymore, hands raised, eyes dead, beyond pride or shame or any emotion except relief that they'd survived. The Canadians who entered the last German-held buildings found scenes that would haunt them. Dead paratroopers at their posts, some clearly killed days earlier, but positions still defended by their comrades, rooms filled with spent ammunition brass, walls scarred by thousands of bullet impacts, and everywhere the smell, death and cordite and stone dust, a smell unique to urban warfare that veterans could never forget. Private Morrison, who'd survived his basement encounter, was among the soldiers who secured the final positions. In his interview decades later, preserved in the Canadian War Museum's oral history collection, he described entering a church that had been a German strongpoint, finding dead paratroopers sprawled among overturned pews, their weapons empty, their faces young despite the war's aging effects. He remembered thinking they looked like the farm boys he'd grown up with, just on the wrong side, and wondering what psychological forces kept them fighting when withdrawal was possible. What mixture of duty and pride and fear of shame compelled men to die for a worthless Italian town in a war they were losing. That question, why men fight past rational limits, what psychological forces override survival instinct, became central to post-war military psychology, studied by researchers trying to understand combat motivation. Ortona provided case studies, evidence that human determination could overcome technological disadvantages, that psychological factors like unit cohesion, leadership quality, and cultural identity often mattered more than firepower or tactics. The Canadian soldiers who survived Ortona were different men from those who entered it 8 days earlier. They'd proven themselves, not just to their enemies but to themselves, discovering that underneath comfortable civilian lives lay capacity for violence and endurance they'd never imagined. They returned to their units with hard eyes and few words, unable to explain what they'd experienced to soldiers who hadn't been there, creating a psychological divide between Ortona veterans and others. They'd earned respect. German prisoners spoke of Canadian ferocity in Ortona, with something approaching awe, and when British and American officers learned details of the battle, their condescending attitudes toward colonial troops evaporated. Ortona veterans had faced one of warfare's ultimate tests and survived. They'd adapted to circumstances that doctrine hadn't prepared them for. They'd won through determination when technology and training weren't enough. But that psychological victory came at tremendous cost. Nightmares, survivor's guilt, difficulty adjusting to normal life after the war, broken marriages, alcoholism, all the invisible wounds that military medicine didn't recognize or treat effectively in that era. The German survivors carried different psychological burdens: defeat, the collapse of their elite identity, the realization that courage and training weren't enough against determined enemies, the growing awareness that perhaps their cause was wrong, that the sacrifices made no sense. Some maintained Nazi beliefs until death, others underwent profound psychological transformation, rejecting ideology, seeking meaning in survival rather than victory. One former Fallschirmjäger, interviewed in the 1980s, described Ortona as the moment he stopped believing in German victory when surrounded in a ruined building, listening to Canadian soldiers blowing through walls like they had infinite resources and infinite determination. He understood that will matters more than weapons, and the Allies had more will because their cause was just. That psychological realization, multiplied across thousands of German soldiers throughout the war's final years, contributed to the Wehrmacht's eventual collapse, not from lack of equipment, but from loss of belief, from the psychological weight of knowing you're fighting for evil against righteousness. The aftermath of Ortona revealed the battle's true significance, not in immediate strategic results, but in long-term psychological and cultural impacts that rippled through decades. Militarily, Ortona's capture didn't dramatically change the Italian campaign's trajectory. The Gustav Line still held, Monte Cassino still loomed, the war in Italy ground on for another year and a half of bitter fighting. But psychologically, Ortona transformed perceptions. It proved that urban warfare would define future conflicts, that soldiers needed specialized training for city fighting. That doctrine developed for open field battles failed in confined spaces. Post-war military academies studied Ortona, teaching mouse-holing techniques, analyzing why technological advantages evaporated in urban terrain, understanding how psychological factors determined outcomes. The United States Marines, preparing for Pacific Island assaults, sent observers to interview Ortona veterans, learning lessons that would save American lives in Manila, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Soviet forces, already experienced in Stalingrad's urban warfare, compared their techniques to Canadian methods, recognizing similarities despite different doctrines, proof that urban combat imposed universal requirements regardless of ideology or nationality. The British, traditionally skeptical of colonial military competence, revised their assessments after Ortona, granting Canadians greater operational independence, respecting them as equals rather than subordinates. This cultural shift, from condescension to respect, affected not just military relationships but post-war political dynamics, contributing to Canada's growing independence from British influence, strengthening Canadian national identity. Back in Canada, news of Ortona arrived gradually, filtered through military censorship softened by propaganda that emphasized victory while downplaying casualties. But soldiers' letters home, the ones that got through, told different stories, of horror and courage, of friends lost, of a battle that tested men beyond any reasonable limit. Canadian families read these letters and understood, perhaps for the first time, that their soldiers weren't playing at war, weren't having adventures, but were dying in Italian ruins for reasons that seemed increasingly unclear as casualty lists grew. This gap between official narratives and ground truth created psychological tension on the home front, contributing to war weariness that governments had to manage carefully through the war's final years. For Ortona itself, the battle's legacy was physical destruction and cultural trauma. The town was rebuilt slowly through the late 1940s and 50s, but it wasn't the same. Too many buildings gone, too many memories embedded in ruins, too much history literally blown apart. The town erected memorials. Canadian flags flew alongside Italian ones, and every December, survivors and their descendants returned for remembrance ceremonies, speaking little but remembering much. These annual gatherings served psychological purposes for both sides. Canadian veterans found some peace in seeing the town alive again, Germans found absolution in Italian forgiveness, and civilians found meaning in transformation from battleground to place of reconciliation. The psychological literature on Ortona emerged slowly, first in classified military studies, then in academic research as veterans began speaking decades later. Researchers identified patterns, combat stress reactions, moral injury from killing at close quarters, the long-term effects of sustained high-intensity combat in confined spaces. They documented how Ortona veterans rated their psychological stress levels higher than soldiers who fought in other Italian battles, suggesting something unique about urban warfare's mental toll. They studied unit cohesion, finding that Ortona survivors maintained strong bonds throughout their lives, attending reunions, corresponding regularly, because only those who'd been there could understand. Only fellow survivors could truly grasp what it meant to fight in hell and emerge scarred but alive. Modern military psychology owes debts to Ortona that few recognize. Concepts like moral injury, combat operational stress, the importance of immediate psychological intervention all trace roots to observations from that battle. The cultural impact extended beyond military circles. Canadian war artists, sent to document the campaign, produced paintings of Ortona that captured not just physical destruction, but psychological devastation. Soldiers with thousand-yard stares, civilians huddled in ruins, landscapes of rubble that conveyed hopelessness and resilience simultaneously. These artworks, displayed in museums and reproduced in textbooks, shaped Canadian cultural memory of World War II, making Ortona synonymous with sacrifice and determination. Literature too. Veterans wrote memoirs. Novelists used Ortona as setting. Poets captured the battle's emotional resonance in verses that tried, always imperfectly, to convey what words struggled to express. One poem, written by a Seaforth Highlander in 1953, ends with lines that became famous among veterans, quote, "We left our youth in Ortona's stones, bought victory with innocence, and learned that courage costs more than we imagined when we were boys who thought war meant glory," end quote. That cultural processing, turning trauma into art, helped society comprehend what soldiers experienced while helping soldiers themselves find meaning in suffering. The technological lessons from Ortona influenced post-war urban warfare doctrine across NATO forces. Mouse-holing became standard technique, taught at infantry schools from Fort Benning to Sandhurst. Engineers developed specialized equipment for urban combat, breaching charges, handheld explosives, portable ramps for scaling rubble. Tanks received modifications to elevate guns higher, to protect against close-range anti-tank weapons. Infantry tactics evolved to emphasize three-dimensional thinking, vertical assault, the integration of different weapon systems in confined spaces. All these developments traced directly or indirectly to Ortona's lessons, paid for in Canadian and German blood, but available free to future soldiers who studied history. The psychological training also changed. Military psychologists recognized that urban combat required different mental preparation than open warfare, that soldiers needed conditioning for close-quarters violence, for sustained stress without relief, for the moral ambiguity of fighting among civilians. Training programs incorporated these insights, though imperfectly, as Vietnam, Beirut, Somalia, Iraq, and Afghanistan would later demonstrate. Ortona's ultimate legacy might be the simple truth that in warfare's most intense forms, human psychology trumps technology, that courage matters more than firepower, that determination defeats doctrine. The Canadians won Ortona not because they had better weapons, they didn't, German small arms were generally superior, but because they refused to quit, because they adapted faster, because psychologically they were tougher in that specific context. The Germans lost not from tactical failures, but from psychological rigidity, from pride that prevented rational withdrawal, from ideological commitment to a losing cause that demanded senseless sacrifice. These lessons apply beyond military contexts. They speak to fundamental human capacities for endurance, adaptation, resilience, the ability to function in chaos, to find order in disorder, to maintain purpose when circumstances seem purposeless. As we close this story of 8 December days in 1943, reflect on what Ortona represents in the broader tapestry of World War II and human history. It wasn't a decisive battle. The war would have ended the same way without it. It wasn't the largest urban battle. Stalingrad and Warsaw dwarfed it in scale. It wasn't even the deadliest Canadian engagement. That dubious honor belongs to Dieppe. But Ortona matters because it revealed truths about human nature under extreme stress, about how ordinary people become extraordinary when circumstances demand, about the psychological costs of warfare that statistics never capture. Private Jimmy Morrison, the farm boy we've followed through this story, returned to Alberta after the war, married his childhood sweetheart, ran a successful farm, raised 4 children, lived to 87, died surrounded by family who loved him. He never spoke much about Ortona, carried nightmares he wouldn't share, woke sometimes in the dark thinking he was back in those ruined buildings with explosions ringing in his ears. But he also carried pride, knowledge that he'd faced horror and survived, that he'd proven himself when it mattered most, that his generation had stopped evil at terrible cost and built a better world from the ruins. That's the psychological legacy of battles like Ortona. They break men but also forge them, destroy innocence but create wisdom, cost everything but teach lessons worth learning. The German paratroopers who died in Ortona's rubble, men like Hans Müller we met at the beginning, deserve remembering too, not as villains but as humans caught in history's currents, fighting for causes they believed in or simply because duty demanded it, dying far from home in an Italian town whose name they probably couldn't pronounce when they first arrived. Their sacrifice was wasted in service of evil, but their courage was real, their suffering genuine, their humanity undeniable. Remembering enemies doesn't excuse their cause, but acknowledges that war's tragedy affects all sides, that psychological wounds don't discriminate by uniform color, that understanding past conflicts requires seeing beyond simplistic hero-villain narratives to the complex reality of humans killing humans for political purposes. The civilians of Ortona, whose town became a battlefield through no choice of their own, who lost homes and loved ones, who rebuilt from ruins, they too carry this story forward, reminding us that war's psychological impacts extend beyond combatants, that communities suffer trauma that echoes through generations, that peace requires not just military victory, but cultural healing. Today, Ortona stands as testament to resilience, a living town, not a monument to death, with citizens who remember but don't dwell on past horrors, who've transformed battleground into home through the same human determination that characterized the soldiers who fought there. This transformation, from ruins to community, from trauma to healing, from conflict to reconciliation, represents hope that perhaps humans can learn from history, can channel courage toward building rather than destroying, can recognize that the same psychological strengths that make us formidable warriors can make us extraordinary peacemakers. So what can we learn from Ortona in 2025, 82 years after those 8 terrible days? That technology doesn't guarantee victory when human will opposes it. That psychological resilience matters more than material advantages in extreme circumstances. That ordinary people contain extraordinary capacities for courage, adaptation, and endurance. That war's true costs aren't measured in statistics, but in individual traumas, broken lives, lost potentials. That remembering requires honoring all victims, even those who fought for wrong causes, because understanding evil requires recognizing the humans who enacted it. That cultural bonds forged in shared suffering can transcend nationality and ideology, creating respect between enemies who recognize each other's humanity. That military excellence means adapting to circumstances rather than rigidly following doctrine. That urban warfare poses unique psychological challenges that require specialized preparation. That veterans deserve support not just for physical wounds, but for moral injuries that society often ignores. That peace requires as much courage as war, that rebuilding demands determination equal to destruction, that healing takes generations but remains possible with commitment and compassion. Did your family experience World War II, perhaps fighting in Italy or surviving the home front? Do you know veterans who never spoke about their service, who carried silent burdens they couldn't share? How do you think modern soldiers compare to World War II veterans in psychological resilience and adaptation? Should militaries emphasize technological superiority or human factors like determination and adaptability? Can urban warfare ever be conducted humanely, or does the environment inevitably create atrocities? How should societies remember battles that were militarily minor but psychologically significant? Share your thoughts, your family stories, your reflections on what courage means and costs. Let's honor these veterans by discussing their legacy honestly and thoughtfully. If this story resonated with you, if you gained new appreciation for what soldiers endured or new understanding of warfare's psychological dimensions, hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel for more deep dives into World War II's human stories. Ring the notification bell so you never miss an upload, because next week we're exploring another fascinating intersection of technology and psychology in war. Another story of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. Another chapter in humanity's long struggle to survive, adapt, and ultimately triumph over adversity. The Battle of Ortona, little Stalingrad on the Adriatic, 8 days that ate a city alive, a story of courage and trauma, adaptation and endurance, a reminder that in warfare's crucible, human psychology remains the ultimate weapon and the final victim. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. Thank you for ensuring these stories survive, so future generations might learn from past sacrifices and perhaps hopefully avoid repeating them. December 24th, 1943, and Lance Corporal Roy Boyd of the loyal Edmonton Regiment enters a 2-story house on Via Orientale with his platoon, 23 men tired beyond description, but still moving, still clearing rooms, still fighting, because that's what soldiers do when stopping means dying. They check the ground floor carefully, grenades first into each room, Then entry with rifles ready. The practiced rhythm they've developed over 4 days of this hell, finding nothing, moving upstairs, spreading out through bedrooms that still smell of the families who lived here before war came. Boyd notices something odd about the walls, fresh plaster marks that don't match the room's age. But before he can say anything, the world explodes, floors collapsing, walls imploding, tons of stone and timber falling as German engineers detonate charges they'd planted hours earlier, waiting for exactly this moment when Canadian soldiers would feel safe enough to relax slightly, to gather together, to become targets. The house pancakes in seconds, burying 23 men under rubble so complete that when the dust settles, there's barely evidence a building stood there at all. 22 of those men died instantly or within minutes, crushed or suffocated, their bodies recovered days later when engineers carefully excavated the site. But Roy Boyd survived, trapped in a pocket created by fallen beams, unable to move, barely able to breathe, surrounded by darkness and the smell of death and his own mounting terror as hours became days. For 72 hours he existed in that tomb, drifting in and out of consciousness, hallucinating, praying, losing hope, regaining it when he heard distant sounds of fighting. Meaning his comrades were still there, still advancing, might still find him. On December 27th, after the Germans had withdrawn and Canadian engineers began clearing rubble to recover bodies, they heard tapping, faint but rhythmic, someone alive down there signaling desperately. They dug for hours, carefully removing stones and beams, finally reaching Boyd, dehydrated, hypothermic, traumatized beyond measure but alive, the only survivor of that deliberate massacre. Boyd's story, documented in loyal Edmonton Regiment records and later in his own sparse testimony, reveals warfare's psychological extremes. Imagine lying buried alive for 3 days, listening to your friends die around you, wondering if rescue will come or if you'll slowly suffocate in the dark, and then surviving, returning to normal life, carrying that memory forever. Boyd never fully recovered psychologically, suffering what we'd now call severe PTSD, nightmares of suffocation, claustrophobia so intense he couldn't enter basements or small rooms, survivor's guilt asking why he lived when 22 comrades died. His case, multiplied across thousands of Ortona veterans, illustrates why this battle held such psychological significance. It wasn't just combat stress, but existential trauma, confrontation with mortality in its most terrifying forms, experiences that shattered assumptions about safety, control, the possibility of protection. The German tactic of rigging houses with demolition charges, waiting for Canadians to enter, then detonating remotely represented urban warfare's psychological dimension. Nowhere was safe. Any building might be a death trap. Paranoia became survival skill. Canadian soldiers responded in kind, developing techniques to detect booby traps, sometimes using the same tactics against German positions, escalating the battle's brutality in cycles of retaliation that left both sides traumatized. The Christmas dinner on December 25, 1943, became legendary in Canadian military history, not for its quality, but for its symbolism. Soldiers eating cold pork chops and drinking warm beer while artillery shells exploded blocks away, taking 30-minute breaks from killing and dying to observe a holiday that seemed absurdly out of place in hell. The Seaforth Highlanders gathered in shifts at Santa Maria di Costantinopoli, a bombed church whose roof was mostly gone, whose walls bore bullet scars, whose floor was covered in rubble and spent brass casings. Chaplains conducted brief services, voices competing with distant gunfire, readings from Bibles carried through Sicily and now Ortona, prayers for the dead already accumulating and for protection of the living who knew they might join those dead before day's end. Private Morrison attended one service standing in the back, unable to concentrate on words, because his mind kept replaying the basement fight, the German's face as the bayonet went in, the sounds that still echoed in his skull. He looked around at his comrades, seeing the same hollow eyes, the same psychological exhaustion that no amount of sleep could cure, recognizing that they were all changed, that the boys who'd trained in England were gone, replaced by these hard men who'd learned that survival requires suppressing empathy, that hesitation kills, that normal human responses, horror at violence, reluctance to kill, had to be overridden or you died. The chaplain spoke of peace on earth, goodwill toward men, and Morrison almost laughed at the absurdity, standing in a ruined church in a destroyed town after days of intimate violence, listening to platitudes about peace while planning to return to killing as soon as the service ended. But he didn't laugh. None of them did, because they also understood the service's necessity. It reminded them they were still human, still connected to something beyond this nightmare, still part of a civilization worth fighting for, even if that fight required abandoning civilization's constraints. That psychological contradiction, being civilized men who must become savages to protect civilization, tormented Ortona veterans for decades, creating cognitive dissonance that manifested as moral injury, as questioning whether actions taken were justified, whether they'd become monsters in fighting monsters, whether they could ever reconcile their war selves with their peacetime identities. The German paratroopers celebrated Christmas differently, grimly, knowing they were losing, that retreat was inevitable, that friends were dying for a doomed cause. Some held brief ceremonies in cellars, singing carols quietly between firefights, remembering Christmases in Germany when they were boys before war consumed their youth. Others rejected observance entirely, viewing it as weakness, channeling anger and fear into fanaticism, fighting with suicidal intensity because if they had to die, they'd take as many enemies as possible. This psychological split within German ranks, those recognizing the cause was lost versus those doubling down on Nazi ideology, affected combat effectiveness, created unit cohesion problems, contributed to eventual collapse. One captured German paratrooper, interviewed on December 26th, told his Canadian interrogators that half his unit no longer believed in victory but couldn't surrender because officers would execute them or their families in Germany would suffer retaliation, so they fought from obligation and fear rather than conviction, a psychological state that produced desperation but not effectiveness, casualties but not results. The civilian population of Ortona, estimated at around 2,000 who hadn't evacuated before the battle, mostly elderly who couldn't travel, families hiding wounded German deserters or Allied escaped prisoners, people too stubborn or traumatized to leave, experienced psychological trauma distinct from soldiers but equally devastating. Maria Capelli, an Ortona resident who was 16 during the battle, testified decades later in interviews preserved by Italian historical societies that she spent 8 days in a cellar with her grandmother, younger siblings, and 3 other families, 21 people total in a space meant for storing wine barrels, no toilet facilities, dwindling food, water from a well they could access only during rare pauses in fighting, darkness broken only by candles, the terror constant and overwhelming. She described hearing explosions so close the walls shook, plaster falling on them, wondering each time if the building would collapse, if they'd be buried like Roy Boyd, except nobody would dig them out. She described the sounds filtering down from above, gunfire, screams in German and English, boots running across floors, once voices arguing in a language she didn't understand right before an explosion that knocked everyone in the cellar off their feet. She described her grandmother praying the rosary continuously, fingers working beads in darkness, lips moving in prayers Maria had heard since childhood, but now sounded desperate rather than comforting, as if God might not be listening or might not care what happened in this Italian town. She described her 5-year-old brother asking when they could go home, not understanding they were home or what used to be home, that the building above them was being destroyed room by room, that their normal life was ending even if they physically survived. On December 28th, when fighting finally stopped, when someone shouted in Italian that it was safe to come out, they emerged into unrecognizable devastation. Their street was gone, not damaged, but gone. Buildings reduced to rubble piles, smoke still rising. Bodies visible in the wreckage, including Signora Rossi from next door, who'd apparently tried to flee and been caught by shrapnel. Maria remembered Canadian soldiers giving them rations, chocolate for the children, water, kindness that seemed incongruous from men whose uniforms were caked with blood and plaster dust, whose eyes looked ancient despite young faces. She remembered asking a soldier who spoke some Italian why this happened, why armies destroyed their town, and him just shaking his head, unable or unwilling to explain what politicians decided and soldiers executed and civilians endured. That psychological wound, betrayal by world that should protect children, anger at all armies regardless of side, loss of innocence and security, affected Ortona's civilian survivors profoundly, contributing to post-war emigration patterns, to collective trauma that shaped community identity, to memorials that honored all victims rather than celebrating military victory. The civilian death toll from Ortona, now estimated by historians at approximately 1,314 people, killed directly by battle action, plus hundreds more who died subsequently from wounds or deprivation, represented roughly 13% of the pre-war population, a catastrophic loss that decimated families and community structures. These weren't soldiers who chose to fight, but civilians whose only crime was living in a strategically positioned town, who became collateral damage in a battle neither side really needed to fight. German military logic said withdraw, Canadian military logic said bypass. But psychological factors, pride and determination and symbolic significance, overrode rational calculation and resulted in senseless destruction. The immediate aftermath of Ortona's capture saw Canadian forces too exhausted to exploit success, German forces too depleted to mount effective counterattacks, and both sides taking stock of costs that seemed disproportionate to gains. The loyal Edmonton Regiment, which entered Ortona with roughly 600 effective strength, emerged with under 400, having suffered 172 casualties, including 63 killed, 23 of them in Roy Boyd's building collapse, losses representing nearly 30% of their fighting strength in 8 days, an attrition rate unsustainable in prolonged combat. The Seaforth Highlanders suffered 103 casualties, including 41 killed, and supporting units like artillery, engineers, medical personnel added more to the toll. Total Canadian casualties exceeded 500 killed, wounded, and missing from a division that had already been weakened by months of Italian fighting. The German 1st Fallschirmjäger Division never released precise Ortona casualties, but post-war analysis combining Canadian intelligence reports, prisoner interrogations, and German unit records suggests approximately 600 to 800 killed, wounded, or captured from the 2 battalions defending Ortona. Losses the Germans could barely afford given overall Wehrmacht decline by late 1943. Beyond statistics lay psychological costs harder to quantify, battle exhaustion rates, soldiers evacuated not for physical wounds but psychiatric breakdown, men who remained with units but were functionally impaired by trauma. Canadian medical officers reported alarming rates of combat stress reactions during and immediately after Ortona, soldiers exhibiting symptoms ranging from mild anxiety and insomnia to complete psychological collapse, catatonia, violent outbursts, suicide attempts. The military's response, typical for that era, was rudimentary. Brief rest, sedation, counseling that amounted to officers telling men to pull themselves together, then return to duty because manpower needs outweighed individual welfare. This approach, now recognized as grossly inadequate, reflected contemporary understanding of combat psychology, which viewed psychiatric casualties as weakness or cowardice rather than legitimate injuries, which prioritized unit effectiveness over individual health, which created stigma, preventing soldiers from seeking help even when desperately needed. Many Ortona veterans suffered in silence for decades, unable to access treatment that didn't exist, unable to discuss experiences that civilians couldn't comprehend, unable to reconcile their traumatic memories with post-war expectations that they simply move on and resume normal lives. The long-term psychological impacts manifested in patterns documented by later researchers studying veteran populations: elevated rates of depression, anxiety disorders, substance abuse, failed relationships, employment difficulties, premature mortality from stress-related conditions. Studies conducted in the 1980s and 90s, tracking surviving Ortona veterans, found significantly higher incidence of mental health problems compared to soldiers who fought in other Italian battles, suggesting something uniquely traumatic about urban combat's intensity, about sustained close-quarters violence, about the psychological toll of fighting in 3 dimensions through buildings that civilians had recently inhabited, sleeping in rooms where family photos still hung on walls, killing enemies in kitchens where meals had been prepared days earlier. This psychological residue, the haunting sense of having violated domestic spaces, contributed to moral injury distinct from combat stress. Guilt not for what soldiers did wrong, but for what war required them to do in contexts that violated deep cultural taboos about homes as sanctuaries, about separating warfare from civilian life, about maintaining boundaries between soldiers and non-combatants that urban warfare inherently erased. The tactical innovations developed at Ortona, particularly mouse-holing but also vertical assault techniques, became doctrine studied at military academies worldwide, influencing Allied operations in subsequent European urban battles, Aachen, Manila, Berlin, and eventually incorporated into NATO training manuals that remained current into the 21st century. But beyond tactics, Ortona influenced military psychology's evolution, contributing to recognition that combat stress wasn't weakness, but predictable response to extreme trauma, that soldiers needed preparation for urban warfare's unique psychological challenges, that post-combat care required more than brief rest. The Canadian Army's post-Ortona assessments, declassified decades later, included recommendations for psychological screening, resilience training, immediate intervention for acute stress reactions, principles that wouldn't be fully implemented for generations, but represented early recognition that warfare's psychological dimension deserved serious attention. These recommendations emerged from brutal experience. Medical officers who treated Ortona veterans recognized patterns, understood that better preparation and support might reduce casualties, wrote reports that influenced policy slowly, incrementally, eventually contributing to modern military psychology's development. The German military, facing catastrophic manpower shortages by 1944, couldn't afford similar introspection, prioritized tactical lessons over psychological welfare, but individual German psychiatrists working with traumatized veterans after the war documented similar patterns, finding that Ortona survivors exhibited symptoms comparable to Stalingrad veterans, confirming that urban warfare's psychological toll transcended nationality or ideology, affected all combatants regardless of side. This universality, that human psychology responds predictably to extreme stress, despite cultural or political differences, became central to modern combat psychology, validating approaches focused on human factors rather than military traditions or national characteristics. Ortona helped prove that courage isn't infinite, that all soldiers have breaking points, that supporting psychological health isn't coddling but military necessity, lessons that seem obvious now but represented radical thinking in 1943, when toughness was valued above all, and psychiatric casualties were often viewed as malingering. For individual Ortona veterans like Private Morrison, the post-battle years brought challenges that victory celebrations couldn't address, returning to farms or factories or schools, trying to resume interrupted lives, discovering that war had changed them in ways that made normal life feel abnormal, that the intensity they'd experienced made peacetime existence seem hollow or meaningless. Morrison returned to Alberta in 1945, married his sweetheart as planned, took over his family's farm, had children, appeared successful by external measures, but internally struggled with memories that wouldn't fade, nightmares that persisted decades, hypervigilance that made him jumpy around sudden noises, emotional numbness that prevented him from fully connecting even with people he loved. He never attended Ortona reunions, couldn't bear to revisit those memories with other veterans, preferred solitude where he could maintain the facade of normalcy without fellow survivors seeing through it, recognizing the wounds he hid. Only late in life, after his wife died and children had families of their own, did Morrison finally speak about Ortona, granting an interview to a military historian in the 1990s, describing not tactics or strategy, but feelings, the terror, the guilt, the sense that he'd left part of himself in that Italian town, that the boy he'd been died there even though his body survived. That interview, preserved in the Canadian War Museum's archives, provides invaluable insight into warfare's psychological reality, stripping away heroic narratives to reveal human cost, reminding us that victory's price includes not just those who died, but those who lived carrying unbearable memories. Morrison's final reflection, recorded on tape that researchers still study, summarizes Ortona's psychological legacy better than any tactical analysis could. He said, "We won the battle, but I'm not sure we won anything worth what it cost. We destroyed a town to capture it, killed hundreds to prove we were tougher than they were, came home with medals and trauma that no medal could compensate for, and for what? So Italy would be liberated a few weeks earlier. So we could say Canadians were real soldiers. Was that worth Roy Boyd spending 3 days buried alive? Worth 22 men dying in a building collapse? Worth Maria Capelli losing her childhood in a cellar? Worth all those German boys dying for Hitler's delusions? Worth Ortona's destruction? I don't know. I fought because that's what we did. We endured because stopping meant dying. But don't tell me it was glorious. It was necessary, maybe. Important, probably. But glorious? No. Never that. Anyone who thinks war is glorious wasn't in Ortona those 8 December days, when hell came to earth, and we all became something less than human to survive. That testament, raw and honest, provides the ultimate context for understanding Ortona's significance, not as military achievement, but as human tragedy, not as tactical innovation, but as psychological crucible, not as victory worth celebrating, but as necessary horror worth remembering. So perhaps future generations might find ways to resolve conflicts without destroying towns and traumatizing everyone involved. The legacy continues today, 82 years later, in Ortona's rebuilt streets where Canadian flags fly alongside Italian ones, where elderly survivors still light candles for the dead every December, where school children learn about the battle in history classes that try to convey both military importance and human cost. The legacy continues in Canada, where loyal Edmonton Regiment veterans and descendants gather annually, fewer each year as time takes its inevitable toll, sharing stories and silence, honoring sacrifice, passing memory to younger generations who never knew war but must understand its reality to preserve peace. The legacy continues in military academies, where Ortona remains required study, where cadets analyze tactics and hopefully learn deeper lessons about warfare's psychological dimensions, about the responsibility commanders bear when ordering soldiers into urban combat, about the costs that continue long after guns fall silent. The legacy continues in medical research, where Ortona veterans' experiences contributed to understanding PTSD, to developing treatments, to recognizing that psychological wounds deserve the same respect and care as physical injuries. The legacy continues in Maria Capelli's descendants, some still living in Ortona, some scattered worldwide, all carrying family history of survival and loss, all understanding that war's victims include those who never wore uniforms. The legacy continues in Lance Corporal Roy Boyd's story, his 72 hours buried alive becoming symbol of endurance, his survival offering hope that humans can overcome unimaginable trauma, his struggles afterward reminding us that survival and recovery aren't synonymous, that coming home isn't ending, just beginning of long journey toward peace with terrible memories. As you reflect on these stories, these human realities behind military history, consider what Ortona teaches about courage and cost, about determination and destruction, about victories that feel like defeats when you calculate the true price. Consider how technology, all the tanks and artillery and modern weapons, mattered less than human will in Ortona's rubble, how innovation emerged from necessity when soldiers adapted to circumstances doctrine hadn't prepared them for, how psychological factors ultimately determined outcomes when tactical advantages evaporated in urban warfare's chaos. Consider what we owe veterans who fought battles like Ortona, not just gratitude and memorials, but genuine support, understanding that their sacrifices included not just physical risk, but psychological damage, that honoring them means addressing their invisible wounds with the same urgency we treat visible ones. Consider how civilian populations suffer in urban warfare, how Maria Capelli and 1,300 others died or were traumatized because armies chose to fight in their home, how military necessity and civilian welfare often conflict and civilians always lose, how reducing war to tactical analysis erases human realities that should never be forgotten. Share your thoughts on these questions. Share your family's war stories if you feel comfortable. Share how this history resonates in your present, because remembering Ortona means more than knowing dates and casualty figures. It means understanding that every statistic was a person, every building destroyed was someone's home, Every victory came at costs that rippled through generations. If this deep dive into Ortona's psychological and cultural dimensions has given you new appreciation for what warfare truly means, for what veterans experienced and how it shaped them, for why peace matters more than we sometimes remember in comfortable times, then hit that like button, subscribe for more explorations of World War II's human dimensions, ring the notification bell because next week we're examining another battle where technology and psychology collided, where ordinary people faced extraordinary circumstances, where history's lessons remain relevant for understanding ourselves and our world. Thank you for spending this time in Ortona's ruins with me. Thank you for honoring these memories by listening. Thank you for ensuring that sacrifices made 82 years ago in an Italian coastal town aren't forgotten, but remembered with clarity about what war costs and why peace matters. Farewell, until next time.